Hello and welcome to the first episode of The Visualist, a podcast journey through the many works of Ridley Scott. From Alien and Blade Runner to The Counselor and A Good Year, I guess. There is not a directorial effort of this visionary filmmaker that we will leave untouched. And who knows, perhaps we'll review a few produced by movies, TV shows and adverts along the way. I'm your co-host Gareth Green, and I will be joined by the incredible writer, director, filmmaker M.K Rhodes as my co-host in this journey through the Governor's oeuvre. Thank you for joining me today, M.K.
Thank you for having me. I think if there's anyone qualified to discuss the filmography of Ridley Scott, it's me, because I've already seen every single Ridley Scott film and almost every single Ridley Scott advert and every single episode of Raised by Wolves, and I don't know why I've gone down this rabbit hole, but I feel like at this point I have an intimate understanding of the work of Sir Ridley Scott.
That's one of the things, when I first came up with the idea to do a Ridley Scott podcast where we just go through all of his films and maybe a few adverts along the way and that type of thing, I thought there's nobody better really to bring on board because it means that I don't have to do any research.
Yeah, I've already done it for you.
Exactly.
And later you get to share in the pain. Because in addition to the highs, considering Ridley Scott has directed some of the greatest films ever made, there are some punishing lows. And I've had to endure them, so now I will enjoy a bit of schadenfreude at having someone else endure them.
Who knows, maybe on this watch we'll find that A Good Year is actually one of those films that, needs a repeat viewing.
I am definitely not really open to the possibility that that's something that can happen. I'm just glad there's no extended cut of A Good Year.
They would have to really give it away with a bottle of Ridley Scott's wine.
Yeah.
That's the only way I could see it actually selling.
Which is a thing now, and which I will try just for the meme at some point. Francis Ford Coppola, who?
We should have a whole episode just about his wine. We
getting
absolutely need to do
progressively more and more drunk.
Yeah.
We'll need that for the A Good Year episode.
Oh, definitely. Yeah, that has to be. If there's something that's going to get us through that film, I think getting absolutely pissed is the thing that's going to do it.
I did look, and I'm not sure if the Ridley Scott wine is on the market yet, but I will keep my eyes peeled.
We'll have to. And for our first episode, we're taking a gentle bike ride through the town of West Hartlepool before drawing swords against each other, as we'll be discussing both Boy and Bicycle and The Duellists. Scott famously shot his 1962 directorial debut short film on 16mm for £65, starring his brother Tony Scott as the titular boy, whereas The Duelist allowed Scott to channel his Kubrickian inspirations and find conflict between Napoleonic soldiers over a 15-year rivalry. But what do we make of Scott's early years? I guess you'll find out after the trailer.
The duelist demands satisfaction. Honor for him is an appetite, an obsession to kill. No apology is accepted, no quarter given. Only death will satisfy honor.
You have insulted me! I have strained my patience in order not to do so. And I demand an apology.
Strife without reason, a quarrel pursued for its own sake.
Ferro intends to kill you.
Gentlemen, prepare to advance.
Nobody understands why you fight with Armand. I believe you feed your spite on him with no more sense than a nasty, blood-sucking louse.
If he so earnestly desires to kill me, he will kill me. Damn it, kill him!
Keep away from him. Keep ahead of him. Put your trust in Bonaparte.
Okay, so I guess the best place to begin with this podcast is really to introduce ourselves and, our connection with Ridley Scott's work and what continues to drive us back to Ridley Scott over his, 40 plus years of filmmaking. So MK, I will say, what is the pull of Sir Ridley Scott to you?
Well, I guess my favorite film of all time is Alien, the original Alien. And it has been since I think I was like 4 or 5 years old. I remember seeing like the TV edit on Sci-Fi Channel, which is a network over here in the US.
Oh no, we have Sci-Fi Channel over here as well.
Oh, okay.
It's probably just a bit trashier.
Yeah, well, it's already pretty trashy. But back then it was a bit more respectable.
Yeah.
I can very vividly recall the scenes of Ripley running through the corridors, just watching it riveted at like age 4 or 5.
Yeah.
Maybe even younger, actually. Maybe even like 3, I'm not sure. I was definitely very, very young.
This sense that it's a film that's just like always been with you in a way.
Exactly. Yeah. And I guess I imprinted on it like a baby duckling. There's just something about that film, which I'm glad that I imprinted on such a masterfully made piece of cinema, because a lot of people get really attached to films in their youth that are shit. And,
yes, I've certainly done that over the years.
You know, like there's things like The Lost World Jurassic Park that you loved to death when you're a kid. You may love it. A lot of people still do, but, you know, I can't watch that film anymore. I think it's not very good. And we can get into the Ridley Scott versus Steven Spielberg debate in a later episode, because they are very comparable in a lot of ways.
Definitely.
But that film has always sort of reigned supreme for me. And I do think it's his best film. I think that's the film where he really finds his voice as an auteur. That is like, I think, the definitive Ridley Scott film, even more so than Blade Runner. Blade Runner is sort of often thought of as the definitive Ridley Scott film, but I really think it's Alien, because that's where all of the things we associate with what a Ridley Scott film is sort of crystallized.
Exactly. I mean, and this is something that we will get into, but the foundations for Blade Runner and the explorations of what it is to be human and that type of thing, those are things that he's already playing with on some level in Alien. Like, all the foundations are in Alien and rooted there as well. Everything with Ash really leads you into what is Blade Runner and the world that he creates with Alien as well, it being a lived-in environment.
And I don't necessarily think he intended all of the thematic stuff in Alien, because you watch interviews with him, he's very quick to shoot down any, as he would say, esoteric interpretations of Alien, even though they're already all there, built into it, not just from his contribution, but from H.R. Giger's contribution and everyone else's. It's like some sort of wholly immaculate conception of a movie where everyone working on it was like some sort of hyper talented genius, and they actually made it come off and work. You got Ridley Scott, you got Jerry Goldsmith at the peak of his game, you got H.R. Giger, one of the greatest modern artists of the 20th century, you got Sigourney Weaver in her first major role, who's one of the greatest actresses of the 20th century. You've got an incredible cast, just an incredible cast.
I mean, and some of the actors they looked into, like John Hurt, for example, who wasn't originally cast in the film. That's just, well, it's incredible that happened.
Yeah, no, you can't even conceive of that role being played by John Finch, I think was his name.
Who eventually he did get round to working with on Kingdom of Heaven, which is unfortunately Finch's last film.
Ah, well, you watch the rushes, which are available of him before he got replaced with John Hurt, and it's just like night and day, completely different performances, completely different screen presence. Although in his defense, he was apparently severely ill.
They never really say what. So I think it's mentioned diabetes may be a thing.
Yeah, diabetic shock or something.
Yeah. I would say as well that with Ridley Scott, what really connected us to as well, the two of us, was both a shared love of Alien specifically. I mean, we got to know each other on a film forum for the series, essentially. And I guess from there, that's always been my go-to Ridley Scott film as well. It's the one that solidified my appreciation of the director and remains my most likely favourite film ever made as well. I continue to go back to it. I continue to write about it as well and find more to appreciate. And I think Ridley Scott will say that I'm looking into it too much in some of the conclusions that I've drawn over the years. But yeah, I feel that it's a film that, as I develop over the years, as my mindset changes, as my view of the world changes, I find something different in Alien to draw out of. I've taken that eye to his other work as well, and it's a varying degrees of success, I would say. But I just feel like I'm drawn to him in that way, in terms of what he's got to offer and what he's got to say next. I feel like it speaks to me as well as a film watcher.
That's going to be the uniting principle behind this entire saga we'll go through, is really leaning into the Ridley Scott as auteur mindset. And I think the things that define Ridley Scott as an auteur are not so much the choice of subject matter usually, although we'll get into that too, because there are lots of recurring themes, recurring motifs, but it's the formal construction of his films.
Yeah.
Especially in his later years, where he sort of becomes like a workman in a lot of ways on a lot of films.
Yeah.
There's a distinct Ridley Scott look. There is a distinct Ridley Scott editing rhythm.
Mm-hmm.
And even though he's changed editors, the two principal editors he's worked with in his career, Terry Rawlings and now Pietro Scala,
Yeah.
the way he handles the camera is very distinct, because he started out operating the camera himself, which he's not allowed to do anymore in Hollywood due to union rules, which was enormously frustrating to him on Blade Runner. But one of the reasons that the Duellists look so outstanding, why Alien, which I think is maybe the best looking movie ever made, with Blade Runner in sort of second place being the most looking movie ever made, is because he had total command of his visual style. The cinematographer was there to collaborate with him on lighting, but blocking everything, that's all him looking directly through the lens himself, which is not something a lot of directors do.
I would say there's a good few directors out there that don't know what they're talking about when it comes to things like lenses and cameras and that type of thing. Ridley Scott is clearly a man that knows his camera inside and out, and he knows what he wants from his image as well. The fact that, I mean, and this is something we'll get into, especially on this episode, that he has a background in art and with an art degree, having studied at the Royal College of London. He, I would say, has a command over the visual style and look of a film that I think few directors do have. I think the people that he brings on board for his films all play into that same principle, is that what draws people to Ridley Scott is his visual storytelling. His images draw you in, essentially.
Yeah, that's definitely how he's been able to coast over some subpar scripts in his career.
Oh, yeah. I mean, the fact that he's a filmmaker that is regularly known to begin shooting without a completed script shows really how much stock that he puts into his visuals, more so than he does into perhaps his story and characters at certain times in his career. I think he sometimes starts a film with an idea of what his characters are and what they're going to experience, and then likes to explore that as he goes.
There's sort of two different types of Ridley Scott film. There's the Ridley Scott film where it's like an off-the-shelf screenplay that he's been hired to direct, and that's where it comes into like a workman thing. And then there are those that he develops himself. And those very intimately, especially in his later years, because it becomes almost like this schizophrenic switch between the two. There's ones that are just these off-the-shelf director-for-hire things, and then there's things like Prometheus and Alien Covenant, where all the flaws in them and all the successes in them are completely, like, you can sense that's all Ridley Scott.
Yeah, definitely.
Even something like Blade Runner 2049, which is very popular, very well received.
Yeah.
That script is him. Like, he developed that script. He developed the characters. He developed a lot of the dialogue. He developed the plot. The opening sequence is taken from his own original deleted opening sequence from one of the earlier drafts of the original Blade Runner. And it's definitely something worth discussing, too, in the way that film differs from how Ridley Scott would have directed it himself, perhaps. And I think those are differences very much worth discussing, and he has himself discussed them in a very enjoyably bitchy fashion.
I love how bitchy he can be, and it's not unwarranted.
One of the really interesting things about Ridley Scott is that he's probably the most accessible of auteurs in terms of his working methods.
Yeah.
He does really in-depth interviews for all his films. He does really in-depth commentaries, very thorough making of documentaries. He even does commentaries on like his deleted scenes and things.
Yeah.
You can learn huge chunks of filmmaking, like how to make a film, just from watching and listening to Ridley Scott movie extra features. If you watch those, you can chart a progression into his later years where certain filters seem to come off.
There is certainly a as you say, a filter that's been turned off, and he is just laying everything out flat in whatever order that it really comes to his mind.
Yeah, he does not care anymore about putting on airs, and he's still going strong. He's churning out 2 movies this year. The last time he did that, they were both pretty good.
Yep.
He's definitely in a class all of his own.
He is a machine.
At least in terms of horsepower. Yeah, he's a machine. He's going to die on set.
But I kind of hope he does when it does come, because that's what he would want.
Yeah, that is what he would want.
This man wants to die making movies. For God's sake, make sure that's the way that he goes out. That's a legendary way to go out.
Exactly, and he storyboards all his films, so they'll be able to complete it if he does.
Exactly. But I mean, I hope that day is many, 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 many years away. But yeah, if he does go out, because I'm not convinced that he ever will, that's the way he has to go.
Yeah, he's gonna become Mecha Ridley Scott at some point. he's going to cheat death.
Okay, so moving on to what we're going to be discussing today, there are a few things for us to go through. Really, the early years of Ridley Scott, and those are going to involve things like his short film Boy and Bicycle, and we do have a few of his adverts to discuss, because before he moved into filmmaking, Ridley Scott was very heavily involved in advertisements, and he actually had his own company under his own name. From, I think it was like 28 years old he was when he actually set up his marketing company. And he was directing advertisements for a great many years, and to an incredible amount of success as well. And then we move over to 1977 was when he finally made the jump from the advertisements into what is his first feature film, The Duellists. And reading up about that as well in the research for the show, it's made a point of to say that really the thing that spurred him on to make a feature-length film is it's always something that he wanted to do, but the thing that was really the inciting incident that made him really think, I have to do this now, was a rivalry of all things with Alan Parker. And that Alan Parker had managed to get a movie made before he had, and he said that it made him sick, and he couldn't sleep for weeks on end, because Alan Parker was successfully making movies and he wasn't yet. So that kind of forced him to come out of his comfort zone and make The Duellists. So that's also what we'll be discussing today. So beginning really with what is his first short film and how he came to make that, we have Boy and Bicycle. As I mentioned in the intro, it was made in 1962. I believe, is that when it was shot or released? Because this is one of those things where Ridley Scott is often quoted as saying that it cost £65 to shoot the film, and that his advice to any filmmakers is really, if you want to make films, start making films. And I absolutely agree with that as well. But I think when it was actually all said and done, it came to something like £315 in the 1960s. And it's a really quaint little film that is really an exploration through nostalgia, I would say. This is actually my first time watching the film. There are a few Ridley Scott films, as we'll find out during this series, that I haven't actually seen, and I'm looking forward to watch as part of this show. But yeah, this was one of the films that I'd always known about. I'd read about it. I'd actually studied some details about it on an art history course, but I'd never actually seen it. So it was good to finally get around to that. And yeah, I quite enjoyed it. What did you think?
As someone who's made a lot of low, no-budget shorts, it's Ridley Scott wanting to make a short film and not having a lot of resources, but of course having a great eye, and just pulling what few resources he does have together. His little brother, Tony Scott, who would then go on, of course, to become a significant director in his own right, especially now as the vulgar auteurist movement picks up steam. It's clearly very influenced by the French cinema of the late 50s, like the 400 Blows and things.
Yes, definitely.
In an interesting way, it may be definitely Ridley Scott's most personal film, at least in the sense of it's him. The character played by Tony Scott is basically just young Ridley Scott. It's the only script that Ridley Scott has ever completely written by himself. It's based on his youth growing up. There are glimpses of visual motifs that would come back later, such as steelwork, the big steelworks that you see in it. are obviously something that would come back in Blade Runner, recontextualized as that, that legendary opening shot of the cityscape with the oil wells belching fire into the sky.
Yeah.
It's not a very easy film to see these days. It's been aggressively scrubbed from YouTube for some reason, for rights violations or whatever, blah, blah, blah. It was briefly released as an extra on the DVD of the Duellists, but was not ported over for the US Blu-ray release. There are sort of low-resolution copies on Dailymotion and other websites.
That's the version I ended up watching, was the low-resolution version.
Even this early, the editing in it is pretty sharp. There's some really sharp cuts. It's not a major work. It's not an essential work. It's Ridley Scott in embryo.
Yeah.
It's not him finding his voice, but it's him starting to learn how to speak it.
Yeah. In many ways, it is obviously his most experimental film in that there's very little in the way of story. It's more of a snapshot of Ridley Scott's life, his day-to-day life growing up. As a result, it is his most personal film that he has made, because it is his viewpoint that is being presented in this film in the purest sense possible. And there's not really an incredible amount of depth to the film, obviously, because it's someone that is developing as a filmmaker at this point. This is the first film, really. I mean, how many people have their very first film on this level thought about and talked about and discussed, and essays written about for years and years to come? But I really like that in this, there are some ideas that, like, in terms of his visual storytelling, in terms of some of the compositions that he presents, there are very early ideas that Ridley Scott has taken throughout his entire career as well. Even though there's some experimentation with the camera, there are certain shots where I thought instantly, oh, this is a Ridley Scott shot. This is definitely what I would expect of him. I wouldn't say he came out of the gate fully formed, but there are certainly ideas there that he took forward as well and explored.
It was what he needed, like a proof of concept.
Yes.
That's really what it is what is called a proof of concept short, where you make a short film to show that, yes, I can do these things. Off the back of that, he eventually started directing television at the BBC. Something not publicly available, it seems, and which I think is the stepping stone between that and the Duellists, is apparently his entry for the BBC traineeship was that he remade the trench scenes of Paths of Glory, Stanley Kubrick's Paths of Glory, as a short film with, I guess, no money. I'm not sure the exact date on that. It would be late 60s. But that, of course, prefigures into the Duellists, because the Duellists, despite being a very, very fine film in its own right, is also very much a Barry Lyndon fan film.
Yes, it is. I would kill to see that Paths of Glory remake from a very young Ridley Scott as well, because that was really what he did use as you say, a proof of concepts, his calling card that got him more directing work. At that point, he had been working as a production designer at BBC, and he worked on well-known shows now like Doctor Who, even Top of the Pops. And then this was the thing that really got him noticed as a director, moving on to TV shows like Z-Cars, and I think The Informer was another one. Z-Cars, I think, growing up was one that was really quite well known over here. It was a really very popular show. My football team that I follow, Everton, they run out onto the ground to the theme from Z-Cars. So I've always had that connection to Ridley Scott as well. But yeah, I would kill to see his Paths of Glory remake. But yeah, we kind of do get it with the Duellists. It seems Kubrick is a giant influence in his filmmaking style and life, really.
Yeah, I would include Legend in that too. His first 4 feature films are sort of him operating in a Kubrickian formalist mode.
Yeah.
And then after that, he pivots hard with mixed success into other modes. In sort of filmmaking, there are sort of 2 major modes you can go into, because they're the ones who seriously developed and established modern filmmaking language. And those are Hitchcock and Stanley Kubrick. Or you can be neither. But obviously, Brian De Palma, for example, is probably the ultimate example of someone taking the Hitchcockian model.
Oh, yeah.
And running with it.
I think with Brian De Palma, what he did with his Hitchcock inspirations, because he has a rather checkered background as well in terms of like voyeurism. I'd read somewhere that a lot of his whole like voyeuristic outlook came from him spying on his dad and him discovering that he was having an affair with somebody else.
Yeah, that was turned into Dress to Kill.
Exactly, yes. Yeah, I believe that they used the same method in that film as what he did to catch his dad cheating. Yeah, I think what Brian De Palma does really well is he takes the subtext, the sleazy subtext in a Hitchcock film. I mean, it's very, very barely just subtext in a Hitchcock film, but he really makes it text. I mean, you look at Body Double.
He just blows it up.
Exactly, yeah. He's like, you know what, this is... He's not content with it just sitting below the surface. He's like, this needs to be brought to the forefront and then expanded on. I mean, Body Double I watched again recently, and that is just a perfect example of that.
Yeah, Body Double is very, very fun trash.
It really is.
Even though you can tell that he's starting to run out of Hitchcockian tropes to exploit, and so he's just recontextualizing.
Doing Hitchcock now.
Yeah. And I think out of all the filmmakers clearly influenced by Stanley Kubrick, I think it is Ridley Scott in his prime, with The Duellists, with Alien, with Blade Runner, and to some extent Legend. He's the only one that really nailed that kind of hyper-confident, hyper-focused brand of formalism.
Yeah.
Of course, The Duellists, it gets uncomfortably close to Barry Lyndon in places visually.
Yeah.
But Alien, despite being worlds away from the look of something like 2001: A Space Odyssey, the way the camera moves, the way the camera tracks through these spaces, the long, slow tracking shots that are so beautiful and which you apparently can't do today, and which Ridley Scott certainly doesn't do today. Those are all
no, unfortunately not.
Yeah, those are all straight out of Kubrick.
Yeah, definitely. And in a way, like the Ridley Scott of old, is far more comfortable allowing audiences to settle into a film than he is now, I think. I think he's got less time for audiences to sit with the film. It's more about... I mean, I guess this is a thing, though, that he has done. He's adapted over the years to different types of audiences and different types of films and filmmaking styles, whilst also kind of retaining what is essentially, quintessentially, a Ridley Scott look and a Ridley Scott feel for his films. But I do feel like in terms of the structure, he definitely has less time for his audience to settle into a film. Everything has to start with a bang, and we have to get straight into it now. Things like Alien, it's all about being drawn into this world. In a way, looking at The Duellists with its very quick runtime comparatively, it's more of a breeze. It's kind of like, I really like what this film is, but it also feels like it's on the cusp of being something greater, something epic if it was allowed to be, and they were allowed to explore this world. And instead, these chapters, they feel a little bit cut down to their bare essentials. And I guess it's Ridley Scott's first film. Obviously, he's dealing with a rather modest budget, let's say. But I feel like there is something in there to really explore and draw out.
It's a film that I get more out of each time I watch it.
Yeah.
Like my rating for it has steadily increased on each rewatch. I think it is basically perfect.
Yeah.
It's an adaptation of a short story, and it sticks very closely to the Joseph Conrad's short story. There's no missteps in the film. Even with the casting, which could be perceived as one due to this kind of interesting array of actors from sort of everywhere. You've got Keith Carradine and Harvey Keitel playing Frenchmen. Yeah. And you've got Albert Finney and all these other English actors.
Like Tom Conti. And I read as well, looking at the credits, Pete Postlethwaite is in there somewhere.
Yeah,
and then you have
I don't know
real northern voices like Alan Armstrong as well.
Yeah, all of this melange of anyone but the French. Playing the French. And it works because the story is in that sort of Joseph Conrad way. It's sort of this existential, it's sort of this very clean, simple existential story. So the fact that they're French is beside the point.
Yeah.
It's more about this never-ending conflict that they don't even remember at this point what even started it, what it's about. It's just this enmity that continues without end.
Yeah.
Until it eventually does end. And I think the ends very strong.
Oh, yeah.
That final shot of Harvey Keitel is spectacular. And apparently it was a lucky break, just a random lucky break in the weather.
It's just a gorgeous shot. It really is.
Yeah.
Like, what a way to leave an impression with that film. You have to be walking out thinking, if anything, Jesus, what a good-looking film that was.
With Barry Lyndon, of course, the reason Stanley Kubrick wanted to make Barry Lyndon was because he wanted to make a film that was composed of images that were modeled on the paintings of the period that the novel is set in. So all the shots are blocked very meticulously, graded very meticulously, lit very meticulously. The biggest strength and the biggest weakness of The Duelist is that that's kind of all Ridley Scott is doing too.
Yeah. I can see why Barry Lyndon has left quite an impression on him, though, considering his background in classical art as well. When it comes to his influences and what we see on screen, we do see those classical paintings that Kubrick was inspired by for Barry Lyndon and what are essentially recreated for that film. We do feel a sense of that in The Duelist as well. But on the other side of things with Ridley Scott, we also have his comic book heavy metal inspired films as well. So we get something across that board. The Duelist is definitely playing into his classical art though, and what Kubrick was inspired by. So I can definitely see why Barry Lyndon influenced him.
Watching them side by side is very instructive in terms of the difference between Ridley Scott and Stanley Kubrick, though. Especially when you read interviews with Ridley Scott where he talks about Kubrick. The thing he always talks about is the form, the formalist filmmaking. And that's kind of all The Duelists is. It doesn't even need to be more than that, because formalist filmmaking on its own is something most people can't really do.
Yeah.
It's about the way the images are crafted, about the way the camera moves, about the way it looks. For whatever reason, especially these days, sort of film criticism is like a dying thing. These days, I don't think, at least a lot of the newer generation of film fans really appreciate formalism. I don't think they pick up on it. I can't even tell you how many times I hear people say that they don't even hear music in a film. They don't hear the musical score.
Yeah.
And The Duelist has a great score.
Mm-hmm.
It's kind of monothematic. It's sort of like about one theme, but it's a great theme. And I believe it's written, the score is by the gentleman who did the score for another very famous piece of British culture, which is The Snowman, if that's what it's called.
It is, yes.
Yeah.
And yes, he did, yeah.
Yeah, the Walking in the Air song.
Mm-hmm.
That's not something that ever gets shown here or that we ever watch.
I was going to ask,
that song,
actually, does that translate into America at all?
No, but the song does. I've heard the song before.
Oh, okay.
And that melody is still very famous. So just as what he copied the trench scenes from Paths of Glory, he steps up his game in The Duelists and essentially makes a feature-length Barry Lyndon fan film. But it's telling how whenever Scott emulates or praises Kubrick, it is always in terms of the craft and never the content. Like, what is Paths of Glory about? Does Ridley Scott care? What is Barry Lyndon about? Outside of its construction, its formal construction.
Yeah.
And Barry Lyndon is about a lot of things. Barry Lyndon is a proper epic. It has Kubrick's very acidic, sort of scathing, removed, like insects pinned on a Coke board view of humanity.
Yes. If you know Kubrick and Kubrick's style, I find it is also incredibly funny as well.
Yeah, no, Barry Lyndon is hilarious in places.
I heard a lot of people talking about how just boring and dull it is, and
no,
I watched it. I will say it was one of the few Kubrick spots in my in Kubrick's films that I hadn't actually seen until very recently. And when I watched it, I was struck by how funny the film was, to be honest.
Yeah, the secret of Kubrick, very much like the secret of Lars von Trier, who is a very direct Kubrick disciple, especially in terms of Barry Lyndon. Barry Lyndon is a huge influence on Lars von Trier, is that almost all of the Stanley Kubrick films are comedies. Even 2001 is very sly and dryly funny in places. But A Clockwork Orange, very vicious black comedy.
Yep. Oh, definitely.
Barry Lyndon, very, very dry, sharp comedy. The Shining, definitely very funny in places.
Mm-hmm.
Full Metal Jacket, again, pitch black comedy.
Yeah.
And then Eyes Wide Shut, which is like a 2.5-hour joke at Tom Cruise's expense, where they're the hottest leading man in Hollywood, cannot get laid, gets like gay bashed in the street, is cuckolded in his imagination the whole way through.
He's cuckolded by a fantasy, is essentially what happens in that film. It's the idea that his wife may have slept with someone that he feels absolutely destroyed by. It's like such a fragile presentation of masculinity. I fucking love it.
And of course there's Dr. Strangelove and Lolita, which are outwardly comedies. I think the only one you can't say is a comedy would be his really early stuff, like The Killing and Paths of Glory. Although The Killing is pretty funny in places too. Again, with the sort of pitch black humor. The only Kubrick film I have not seen is his debut, Fear and Desire, which may be an unintentional comedy.
Yeah, I watched that not too long ago, maybe only a couple of months ago, and it's not good.
Yeah, he wanted every copy of it destroyed. He wanted nobody to see it, so I've sort of respected his wishes and not watched it.
Yeah, it's probably for the best.
Yeah, I'll get around to it though, because he is the greatest filmmaker of all time.
Oh, definitely.
And I think that's again, one of the big things that separates Ridley Scott from Kubrick is that Ridley Scott does have a pretty good sense of humor, like when you watch him in interviews, but he's not very skilled at comedy. That is not where his skills lie. And there are parts of Alien that are very funny, but you feel like those are improvisations from the cast. Yeah,
it's more about like the situation and environment that he's created and allowed the cast to create their own funny little moments.
Yeah, like Yaphet Kotto is very funny in Alien. Even just little things that you might not notice on the first viewing, like when he tells Ash to get out of his seat, and then he like brushes off the seat. It's just
I fucking love that touch.
Yeah, it's a great piece of acting. It tells you everything you need to know about that character and their dynamics, their relationship between each other. Again, that's one of the greatest casts ever assembled for a movie. They're just bouncing off each other so brilliantly.
Oh yeah, it's truly lightning in a bottle.
Yeah, but the Duellists, it has some comedy.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't have any like foundational worldview. I think it's a good story, and that's obviously what drew Ridley Scott to it. But he doesn't read anything into it necessarily. He says, this is a good story and I can use it as a foundation for my visuals. And really, that's all you need to do.
I think so. But I do think that there are some subtexts and themes at play in The Duellists, but they are on a very kind of basic level. I do think that there is something that begins here with Ridley Scott's work that he does explore elsewhere as well, which is like the destructive force of masculinity, of ego, of hubris, that type of thing. He brings that into into play with this film, even though he doesn't do much with it. There's a fantastic exchange as well between Harvey Keitel's character. Is it Thoreau?
Yes.
Yeah, Harvey Keitel's character and
Lieutenant, as you would say.
Yes, Lieutenant. But between his character and Keith Carradine's love interest at the time, and I actually wrote it down as well.
Oh, there's a great line.
She enters the tent of Lieutenant Thoreau and is essentially coming to challenge him on this rivalry that he has with her partner at that time. And once he finds out who she is and who she's connected to, he brings up his sword and really holds it to his crotch, like it's obviously in a very phallic display. In another kind of like, these are all to me dick measuring contests. And he says, I once knew a man who was stabbed by a woman, gave him the surprise of his life. And then she responds with, I once knew a woman who was beaten to death by a man. I don't think it surprised her at all. And I think that straight from the off is something that we see explored time and time again in Ridley Scott's film, is essentially women finding their voice and finding their standing in a typically man's world and finding these strong women in these worlds as well. And I know that you couldn't see that, but I used man's world, quote unquote.
Oh no, that's absolutely true.
This is the beginning of that, and he takes it throughout his career as well.
Yeah, and in fact, aside from his visual style and his love of gore, and violence.
Yes.
Because that is definitely one of the huge things that separates Ridley Scott from, his other sort of mainstream successful contemporaries is Ridley Scott leans fully into gore and violence and the grotesque. He really appreciates the aesthetic qualities of that, which is one of his defining hallmarks as an auteur, I think. But his other major one is, again, as you say, that almost Beauty and the Beast motif that returns time and time again in his Alien films and Legend and Hannibal and arguably, All the Money in the World too.
Yeah, definitely.
Is that, the lone woman pitted against a masculine monster, be it extraterrestrial, mythological, or human. And he does not romanticize the situation or turn the woman into a wooed damsel, even when he literally does that, because that's sort of one of the fantasy tropes in Legend. He completely swerves and subverts it in the last act. Yeah. Where it was all her pretending.
Yeah.
And it's always about the woman outwitting this beast. And there's also the presentation of sexualized bodies in his film, which is refreshingly even-handed and always has been. One of the things that Ridley Scott does not like sex scenes. And he says sex is only interesting when you're doing it, which is which is definitely a valid viewpoint considering the way most filmmakers shoot sex scenes. But again, as with his, I don't think Ridley Scott has a a deep abiding love for gore and violence. He just recognizes, as a fine artist and a painter, and as someone who's studied Francis Bacon he recognizes the aesthetic qualities of it. And he of course recognizes the aesthetic qualities of, the body and the sexualization of that. And whereas someone like Brian De Palma is just laser focused on titties and curves, Ridley Scott is not like that. Again, he's not his films, especially the Alien films, have a distinct sexual charge to them, but it's not a horny Brian De Palma thing. It's this is about the aesthetics. It's all about the aesthetics for him. And I really appreciate and admire that, because it's very even-handed. Consider the way he very generously showcases Brad Pitt's sculpted torso in Thelma and Louise, which is one of the most effective instances of a straight male filmmaker explicitly emulating the female gaze. I mean, he even went so far as personally missed Brad Pitt's abs and chest with Evian water from a spray bottle, sitting there framing it, lighting it exactly the way he wanted, to the point where Gina Davis was getting kind of jealous and angry that he was paying no attention to her and how he was setting up the scene.
In a way, I've kind of I've read into his films in a way as being, and even I guess even Tony Scott's films have this as well, but being a little bit more homoerotically charged as well. But I think it's mainly because of, in the landscape that his films are made, because he spends that time providing, really, as you say, an equal viewpoint. He likes to kind of provide that equal standing for both male and female characters in his film. I would even say, in terms of the male relationships and things like The Duellists as well, there's a sense that there's a homoerotic charge to these films as well.
Oh no, definitely. That's another thing that's very distinct and interesting about Ridley Scott, is that he has a lot of gay collaborators behind the scenes.
Yeah.
Even his most seemingly hyper macho film, Gladiator, is co-written by
John Logan, is it?
Yeah, John Logan. John Logan is gay, openly gay. A lot of the things he writes are very gay. Even when he wrote the James Bond movie Skyfall, he queered James Bond in that.
Yeah, it was great as well. I mean, I have a lot of issues with that film, but the fact that, as you say, he brought this idea to James Bond that he was potentially, for Queen and Country, he would do anything. He was a bisexual spy.
Yeah.
That's a fucking great addition to that character lore. Obviously, everybody hated that, and they've never mentioned it again since.
But yeah, in Alien, it ended up on the cutting room floor. But in Alien, it was basically implied that, everyone is kind of bisexual. And everyone just kind of sleeps with each other whenever.
It's the future we're all heading towards.
Yeah, and then he brought that back in Alien Covenant, which actually has a prominent gay couple. And then, of course, there's all the unsettling sexual stuff with Michael Fassbender on Michael Fassbender, which is very nice, and I appreciate. That's one of the things that just that is such an underappreciated film, which I think will someday get.
It truly is.
Yeah, I think that's probably going to end up being like his last like really great work.
Yeah,
it's not the best Ridley Scott movie, but it is the most Ridley Scott movie.
Oh God, yeah. I think Ridley Scott's exercising a lot at that point in his career, looking back over his career, having things to say as a filmmaker and where his standing is as well. But like, it is the most Ridley Scott of his films. I genuinely love Alien Covenant in a rather large way, even though I recognize that it has faults. But
it has very severe faults, but its strengths it peaks so high. It is a really good film, and it's one of the best, I think, auteurist Hollywood movies of definitely the last decade. It's a very impressive film, and the fact that people like really hated it and rejected it, I think, only bolsters its its strengths, because they didn't get it, they didn't understand it, especially compared to its predecessor, which is bizarrely well liked in comparison, even though it doesn't even really feel like a movie. It feels like a 2-hour trailer for a movie that you're never going to see.
We mentioned beforehand, I don't think I have the same view of Prometheus as you do. But even so, of the two films, I'm always surprised that Prometheus is the one that really people are now returning to and rejudging as being this undiscovered gem, this thing that people like overlooked at the time. If anybody's going to do that with any of those films, it has to be Alien Covenant to me.
Yeah, no, Alien Covenant feels like a return to the era of Ridley Scott that we're sort of launching into. In terms of its pacing, it is very, very 70s. It's a beautifully paced movie. Yeah. There are shots and takes in that movie that last longer than, 10 seconds.
Yes. Yeah.
It has real mood. It has real weight to it in terms of the imagery and the atmosphere, which Prometheus does not have. Prometheus is a very airless movie. It has no mood. It can't even keep a straight tone within a single scene. Whereas Covenant is just a beautifully crafted film.
Talking about atmosphere as well, going back to the Duellists, one of the things that I wanted to bring to light straight away is, I first off want to say I love the lighting in this film, especially for some of the interiors. I know that with the exteriors they're dealing with, all of this film is shot on location. There were no sets built for this film, no exterior sets built for this film.
No, and in fact, Ridley Scott was so brilliant a craftsman already that a lot of the interior scenes are literally shot in the hotel they were staying at, and he just redressed it slightly because he's so brilliant with how he positions the camera. And that's another big element of his specific style of formalism, is he always knows where to put the camera.
Yeah.
Although, again, that's shifted later in his career because he's sort of adopted more of a coverage style of filmmaking.
He has, definitely, yeah. It's more about he knows where to place 3 cameras now.
Exactly.
And shoot only about a third of the takes, if that.
Exactly. Whereas that's one of the huge differences between Ridley Scott now and Ridley Scott in his early Kubrick period, I would say, is that in his early Kubrick period, it was all about camera placement. Very specific, very specific. This film has that in spades. And I actually think the film visually that this most aligns with in his career, which will definitely be an interesting episode to talk about, because it's kind of like a lost Ridley Scott movie. Nobody talks about it. Nobody's seen it. It was reviled. It bombed. It has severe ideological problems that we'll get into. But this very much resembles 1492, Conquest of Paradise. Even the way it's graded, that's one of the differences between this and Barry Lyndon, is that there's a specific style of grading in the Duellists, where it's definitely like a photochemical filter applied. And he brings that back for 1492, and he leans really heavily into it, and it looks stunning.
I will say it's one of the few Ridley Scott films that I'm looking forward to cover on this podcast, because I haven't actually seen it. I do own it on Blu-ray, but I just haven't gotten around to watching it at this point in time.
Yeah, it really is just this lost Ridley Scott film. He never talks about it. No one ever talks about it. It's never been restored. Even the European Blu-ray release that says it's a restoration, it's clearly not. It's clearly like some ancient, dated, ratty old transfer with wrong colors. But no, that's definitely a film that I have a lot of thoughts about, and I think is going to be a really good, interesting episode.
Absolutely. I mean, because when it comes to those type of films as well, there are two ways that you can always watch them, and those are as truly just historical portrayals or as films. And I always try to kind of view them in both the light, but I always tend to fall on the idea of how is it as a film, unless it is doing something that is, and this one might be the example of this, but unless it is doing something that is blatantly offensive and rewriting history in a very offensive way, which it very may well do.
It sidles right up to that line and tries to have it both ways.
Right, got you.
I can empathize with the point of view that you should dismiss the film because it does that. I have huge problems with that.
Yeah.
But I think it is a very well-made film, aside from that. Visually, orally, it has the only other Visualist score for a Ridley Scott movie next to Blade Runner, and it's a really good score. And it has Sigourney Weaver. It has his reunion with Sigourney Weaver.
Of course, it's another Sigourney Weaver and Ridley Scott reuniting on another controversial film. They came back around as well for, of all films, Exodus, Gods and Kings. It's like, is that all they can do together now?
I don't know if you've seen that one, but I will not be revisiting that one before we talk about it. One. Yeah, I rewatched it. I watched it for the first time recently, and I do not feel compelled to revisit it. It's still fresh in my memory.
That's okay.
Looping back into his work with actors, the Duellists, I don't think he ever worked with Keith Carradine again, but he did work with Harvey Keitel again in Thelma and Louise.
Yeah.
Harvey Keitel is great in that movie.
Yes.
Accent shaky notwithstanding. And in fact, there's a little anecdote, I think it might be in the Duellists commentary in another interview I read, where Ridley Scott ran into Harvey Keitel at a suit shop recently, a few years ago. Harvey Keitel just sort of looked up at him because they were on different levels getting fitted for like a suit or something. And Harvey Keitel just said to him, "Hey, bastard, why don't you hire me for another movie?" And Ridley Scott just looked down and said, "I'll think about it."
I will say, of the two actors, I do like Keith Carradine in this film as well. I'm not too fussed with the accent work. As you say, it's all over the shop in terms of accents. Keith Carradine feels like he's not doing as much as Harvey Keitel, but Harvey Keitel still has a bit of New York about him. And everybody else just sounds like a stuffy Brit anyway, so it doesn't really matter that much. That I can suspend my disbelief for that. But I think of the two actors, Harvey Keitel is the one that leaves most of an impression, mainly I guess because he's allowed to, with his character being one who is fueled exclusively by rage. Yeah. The fact that this whole thing in the Duelist kicks off due to what seems to me like a very trivial exchange, really, that they come to forget later on. It becomes much more than just the exchange that they had. I love the character that Harvey Keitel presents here, because I feel like every time he's on the screen, it's popping, it's alive.
There's a jolt of danger to him.
Yeah.
The duels themselves are very intense and violent.
That caught me off guard in a big way, because I hadn't seen the Duelists for a long time, and the near scalping was something that I completely forgot. And when you have that little cutaway to Harvey Keitel on the floor with the blood pouring down his face, and somebody saying he can't continue because he cannot see. I was like, oh, Jesus. And Scott knows how to cut to it right for the maximum impact as well.
Yeah, no, that's another thing. This film, even though Terry Rawlings did not edit the film, he edited the sound on the film, but he did not edit the film itself. This already has, stylistically, a lot of the editing scheme that Ridley Scott and Terry Rawlings would develop in Alien and then further into Blade Runner. And then it starts to abate in Legend. But there's a very distinct editing style to these films. They're very hard cuts in places. There's lots of flash forwards and flashbacks. It's very strikingly edited.
Yeah.
Again, this is very much a Ridley Scott film. Like it's his first, and this is It's 1977. So this is the same year that David Lynch debuted with Eraserhead. So this was like a huge year for major auteurs debuting with their style fully formed already.
Yeah.
There's all sorts of brilliant little touches in it. Like the way one of the duels is in like this stable.
Which is the best duel.
Yeah. And when the swords like slide against the wall or connect with the wall, sparks fly everywhere. And
each sword was connected to a battery.
Exactly. Yeah, he connected it to a car battery. He wanted sparks, and he got them.
Oh, definitely. Yeah, and I love the cut into that action piece as well, that set piece, because at that point, this is the third duel that we have into this film. And the duels have this real sense of rhythm and sense of tension, of building, of suspense. And each one seems to get longer than the other. But by the third one, rather than allow us to go through the same ritualistic rigmaroles as they do their little nods towards each other and hold the swords up in their own little rituals and that type of thing, he just cuts straight into the action, into a duel that has clearly been going for many, many minutes. Both of the characters are completely drained, they're completely exhausted, and like I love this heavy breathing that you can hear constantly. And at this point they're just lunging at each other, all of this fancy twirling and like all of these show-offy kind of moves that they do with the sword, this fencing, that's all gone out of the window now. It's kind of just pure exasperation, and I guess by Harvey Keitel character, it's just pure hatred just being fueled on by that until they can't continue anymore. That's my favorite set piece in the entire film, and I just love the way it throws us directly into it.
Yeah, my favorite set piece is the Winter War, where they're forced to fight side by side together. There's those zoom-ins on their faces, which is very definitely a Ridley Scott signature, because that's one of the few things that's survived intact into his modern work, is that he loves his zoom lenses. And he loves just slowly zooming into a character's face, not like a Kubrick stare kind of zoom. I mean, you even have that in like Gladiator. Like there's lots of them in Gladiator, to the point that it almost becomes self-parody. That's a defining Ridley Scott shot, and it already is here fully formed. And again, the grading in that scene is beautiful.
Yeah, he does so much with so little in that sequence as well. I think it was shot in Scotland and on the Highlands, I did read. As being somebody who is from the north of England anyway, I've always looked towards our countryside, and there is beauty to our countryside, but there are also these sparse, empty hills and mountains where nothing grows. I don't think filmmakers really make use of, and I think this film really does. It kind of presents it as being this empty, apocalyptic wasteland, and he nails that. Like, I really get the sense that this is the end of things as well during this scene, even if it is just like I say, he does so much with so little. We don't really see the grand armies marching or anything like that, but it's more so like the odd little pockets that we see, like the frozen, overturned carriage with soldiers
with
frozen
corpses.
inside.
Yeah, that's so good. That's, again, the Ridley Scott eye for grotesquerie.
Yeah, oh, absolutely. Yeah, and but it brings so much to the world. You already know so much without there being, like you say, 1,000 extras. You know so much just in that moment about like how unforgiving this landscape is.
You can't really make the direct through line from this to Alien in terms of what they saw when they screened it and said, okay, this guy. But it's definitely the making huge images out of almost nothing.
Yeah.
Because Alien did not have a huge budget. In fact, he had to fight to get the budget to be even what it was. And Alien looks enormously expensive.
Yeah.
The intensely detailed production design. I don't even know how you could do it today.
No.
Because Prometheus, which had like a $200-something million budget, or no, well, not that much, but like over $100 million, does not look as detailed.
I think Prometheus had something like a $150 million budget to $160 million, but then the official one that they put out was 120 because they had got some tax breaks. But even so, what you're looking at really is about $160 million on screen.
But The Duellists is absolutely a flex, because it's Ridley Scott demonstrating that he can do Kubrick-level Barry Lyndon-style visuals with almost nothing. At least comparably nothing.
Absolutely. I mean, that's what got him noticed as well in terms of his early work, was the idea that he shot that Paths of Glory shot on very little budget, but it looked much more than it did. I suppose one of the things that we need to talk about is the way that this film sounds and the relationship that Ridley Scott has with the composers that he's often used, because sometimes that can be quite fraught.
Ridley Scott has a very complicated relationship with composers and his use of music, which we can get into starting with Alien.
Yes, definitely.
But no such problems on the Duellists, which just has a very, very excellent, straightforward score that did not get like butchered or anything of the sort.
No, and I like it. It's a simplistic score as well. Like, it's limited in terms of the amount of variation in terms of the cues that are provided. But because of that as well, the score itself becomes a signifier of a certain feel, of a certain, it starts to hit the beats with Ridley Scott as well. You understand exactly what's being commented on, or where we're moving, what direction we're moving into, because of the score hitting this beat again. And yeah, I think it's really quite effective, even if there is not as much variation as you would traditionally expect from other films. It's a lovely score.
Oh no, definitely. It's monothematic. It's sort of one theme, but it's a great theme.
Yeah.
Like, I can remember it right now in my head.
Yeah.
Which you cannot necessarily say the same for the scores for later Ridley Scott movies.
That's one of the things about his films that I have found somewhat a dissatisfaction about them, is that there's really a lack of musical quality towards some of his films, and there are some composers that he sticks with for a while that don't really play towards the best. And considering somebody who has such a strong visual style, sometimes his music is just, it doesn't really do much for the film.
That's a broader filmmaking trend in general these days.
I mean, that is something, I'm already thinking of a few examples, but that is definitely something to get into along the lines, because his as you say, his experience with composers really begins with Alien. And yeah, I have a lot to say about that as well, especially when we come to discuss the comparison of the music to Alien Covenant as well. Mm-hmm. So moving over to the stats and facts about the Duellists. Obviously, there is very little that we can provide in terms of the stats and critical reception to Boy and Bicycle, but talking about the Duellists, as mentioned during the episode, it was made for a budget of $900,000, did you say?
Yeah, $900,000.
In terms of the box office, the only figure that I did find was that in America, it did make just $900,000. However, it was released on very, very few screens. I read somewhere that it was a total of like 9 screens at one point, and that was it.
Yeah, there were only like a handful of prints even struck. It was just a film that was quickly buried outside of its festival release.
Which is a shame, because, I mean, they premiered it at Cannes, and it was nominated for the Palme d'Or. The Palme d'Or. You know what? I've really tried throughout this episode to just avoid any French words whatsoever, because it's really not my forte.
No, you did it right. Palme d'Or.
Palme d'Or, right. Brilliant.
He won a prize too, I think, for Best New Director.
And there we go. And yet the studio just completely lost faith in it and just let it flounder. I feel like the release was just a contractual obligation.
Yeah, they didn't have much faith in it, again, because of its proximity to Barry Lyndon. And Barry Lyndon, despite being nominated for a lot of Academy Awards and things, was not a huge hit. And that's why Kubrick then pivoted into The Shining, because he needed a hit.
Oh yeah, absolutely. But it's like, what did they know what they were getting into when they signed on to make this film? Did anybody read the script and see what they were making? I always hear stories about this, about studios essentially allowing filmmakers to make a certain type of film and then being like absolutely shocked and appalled when that film is exactly as advertised.
Yeah, well, that's Blade Runner, that's Legend.
Yeah, it's definitely a thing that haunts his career from this point for the next few years, certainly. But yeah, talking about the critical reception, this film was actually well received at the time, and it's come to be regarded as being like a undiscovered gem in Ridley Scott's like filmography. It's one that people seem to be rediscovering and finding out that actually this is pretty damn good.
Yeah, it's the only Ridley Scott movie that Pauline Kael, the infamous New Yorker film critic, liked. And in fact,
Oh my.
when you read her reviews, she didn't just like it. She's like glowingly effusive in her praise of it. And she even ends on this note: the emotional discord in the images affects one's susceptibilities like the pealing of bells. No bell ever seems to be struck for the first time. Carradine and Christina Rains have a lamb-like ease together, and in the scene when Dubert and his lady plight their troth and kiss, their white horses, standing just behind them, nuzzle each other. This is either the luckiest shot a beginner movie director ever caught, or the most entranced bit of planning a beginner ever dared.
I actually wrote in my notes, that is some great horse acting in the background of this shot. And I read up afterwards, there was a trivia, this was on the trivia section on IMDb, so God knows how true it is, but it says it's mentioned in the director's commentary that the reason Christina Rains is laughing in that scene is because the horse on Keith Carradine's shoulder has a giant erection. There was supposed to be no laughter in that scene whatsoever, but Ridley Scott felt that the way that it was played in that scene was far more naturalistic. It was far more playful, so definitely why not keep it in? But yeah, it's always good to know that just out of shot, there's a giant horse penis.
And of course, Barry Lyndon has some good horse acting too, which is, again, a direct correlation between the two. Then, of course, after that, Pauline Kael savaged every single one of his movies. Even Alien, her Blade Runner review is actually really good. It's like vicious toward the film. You know, it's the theatrical cut of the film. So, you know, in some ways it kind of deserves it. But she has some really bitchy quips in there that are funny. Like she makes fun of the costume design of Sean Young and says how her shoulder pads enter a room long before she does. Things like that.
I do like Pauline Kael. I always have. I don't always agree with her, but I think that she can write a scathing review like no other in that way as well. It's always entertaining, even if you don't agree with it.
Yeah, that Blade Runner review wounded Ridley Scott. That's the last critical review he ever read of any of his movies.
Oh, really?
Yeah, it really hurt him and upset him. And when you watch in interviews where he references it, you can see like the rage boiling up within him.
I suppose it's like the battle that he fought on that film, the war that he waged with the studio to culminate with that review is probably the cherry on the cake. It's like that, you weren't there, man, you weren't there, type of response.
Exactly.
I can understand that, certainly. But yeah, going by the critical consensus, as we say, on Rotten Tomatoes, it has a 92% score, 7.3 out of 10 average rating. And yeah, I mean, even from an audience level, it has a 7.4 out of 10 and an 83% audience score on Rotten Tomatoes, with the average rating being 4 out of 5, which I was quite shocked because it is one of the little seen films of his career. So it was good to see that it had been so kind of well received, at least, or has been in the years since.
I think it's a film that will get its due when it's more widely accessible. Yeah. Because 1492 is not necessarily easy to view. It's not available on streaming services. I mean, it is, but it's one of those things where you have to pay to rent. It was on Criterion Channel for a little while, and it's absolutely a film that is something that the Criterion Collection should release. This desperately needs a new 4K scan, because the current HD master is from 2004 in the DVD era, and it looks fine, but I mean, this is a film that could look much, much better. And the Blu-ray release in the US is long out of print and fetches high prices. Again, it's one of those films that's just sort of fallen by the wayside, and it's one of Ridley Scott's sort of neglected children, because he's actually very hands-on in a lot of the way his films are presented on home video. And Alien gets a fresh 4K scan every 5 or 10 years, and he sits in there and he regrades it. And it's the same thing with Gladiator and all of his films. But The Duellists is one of those that just, he doesn't seem to dwell on much.
I think there's an element of what's most commercially viable now with him as well. I think this late in his career, with him working on, like you say, he's always got several irons in the fire. I mean, we were moments away from him making a Monopoly movie at one point. We could do a whole episode in just the unmade Ridley Scott movies, of which there are, thousands.
Oh, maybe we should.
But yeah, I think that with even like returning to his work, there always has to be this kind of, is this financially viable? Unfortunately, I don't think at this point the Duelist would be immediately. It's something that would grow an audience over time, and it's definitely primed for it, I think. It just needs that kind of that treatment, because it has the potential of being a beauty. I mean, it's a beautiful looking film, but it has the potential of being so much more in terms of home video. It's shot mostly like outdoors, and as we say, in real locations. You could really get like if they have access to the original print, you can bring out that texture of film grain that these type of films need, I always find. And yeah, I think it has the potential to be something that's truly gorgeous on 4K.
Oh, absolutely. But then, of course, there's the fact that the Criterion Collection doesn't do 4K. So if they ever resorted to it, we still wouldn't get that. Who knows? Maybe Arrow will answer our prayers someday.
Fingers crossed. Maybe it'll be like an Arrow Academy film.
Yeah,
for
exactly.
the kind of Criterion alternative.
I don't even think it got a UK Blu-ray release at all.
For the UK audiences, in order to see it, we have a standard imprint edition. I think it's from Australia, and that is £30 without postage.
Yeah, that imprint from Australia edition is pretty nice, though. It's got the same packaging is beautiful. It's got the same transfer as the US release, but it's maybe a bit better encoded. The US release is out of print and goes for used copies start at like $80. So
that's the thing with these limited releases. Unfortunately, they come and they go. I know it's because they only have the rights for a limited amount of time as well in order to pump out the releases, but it's a shame because there's a lot of films out there that, unfortunately, if you miss that very narrow window, you've got no chance.
Yeah, I kind of regret not getting that Australian limited edition now, because it's a handsome package.
It really is. It's got a lovely cover as well.
Yeah. Oh, well.
Okay, and that's it for this first episode of our Ridley Scott podcast. Next week, we're going to be moving on to Alien, and this is really the start of the Ridley Scott hits, like the mega hits. And I guess the Alien's going to be quite a long episode. In fact, we've had to spread it over 2 separate episodes, so the discussion will be split in 2, in which for God knows how many hours we will be speaking about this classic sci-fi film that really brought us together in a community.
Yeah, it's gonna take some time.
Yeah, it certainly is. There's going to be a lot to discuss. And it's one that, I mean, anybody that knows me knows that I have talked a hell of a lot about Alien. So, it's going to be good to go over it all again.
But you've never talked about it with me.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I get more out of that film the more I watch it. And to be honest, that's probably much to Ridley Scott's dismay. It's a film that I feel familiar with, but each time I watch it, I'm peeling back another layer. It's like the Shrek onion.
Yeah, it's a film that seems straightforward on the surface, but it really does contain multitudes. It is labyrinthine in its ability to be interpreted. And there's, of course, a recent documentary just about that, which Ridley Scott pointedly declined to participate in because he hates when people try and interpret Alien. But I think my interpretation is pretty sound. I think if he, on the off chance he listened to it, he'd say, yeah.
From behind his cigar.
Yeah, he'd begrudgingly nod.
But I'm really looking forward to it. This is going to be a cracking discussion. It's one of my favourite films. It is my favourite film of all time. So bring it on, roll on next week.
Yeah, it'll be a good one. I'm excited just because it gives me yet another excuse to rewatch the best movie ever made, which is Alien.
Absolutely. Well, until next time, I've been Gareth.
And I'm MK.
And thank you for listening.